to all 5 of you who showed up to my talk. Thank you for showing up. This is probably because everyone else at this conference has already figured out how to make the case for GraphQL. They've already convinced their entire organization that they need GraphQL, and they're already using it. So I'm assuming that GraphQL is good. All those people, this is recorded. You can see it later online. My name's Jon. I work on the front-end infrastructure team at Coursera. If you're not familiar with Coursera, we're helping transform people's lives through access to the world's best education. We do that through building product, and in the case of our team, we help figure out the tools, workflows, and processes that our front-end engineers and our web engineers use to actually build that product. And on our team, we love GraphQL. Like, I talk about it all the time. Every time there's a question that comes up, I say, but what if there was GraphQL? Someone asks me, what's for lunch? I'll say, what about GraphQL? GraphQL sounds like a good thing to have for lunch. But to be serious, GraphQL is incredible. We find that it changes a lot of how you build things, and we want people all over the place to use this as well, especially within our organization. But this talk is not about the basics of GraphQL. I'm not going to sit here and teach you the syntax and show you how arguments work, or maybe show you, all these other things. I'm not covering that because everyone else at this conference has done a great job of doing that. What I'm going to be here to talk to you all about is figuring out how you can get your GraphQL working throughout your organization. I'm going to give you the questions, the vocabulary, and all the things that you need to know to talk to people throughout the rest of your team. So, who's here? Is everyone here familiar with Lord of the Rings? Anyone not familiar with Lord of the Rings? Too bad, I don't have time to cover it. So, in Lord of the Rings, you have this ring, this one ring to rule them all. And it's somewhat evil, and they kind of cast it as this villainous thing, which, yeah, actually true, it's probably villainous. But for the sake of this talk, let's say that the One Ring was actually good. And we actually wanted the One Ring. But we need the One Ring to get to Mount Doom in order for it to actually work. So in this case, GraphQL is the One Ring. It's the one API to rule them all. We think that GraphQL is the one API that all developers will need to know, and something that your entire organization will need to know. So the journey to getting this GraphQL to be successful at your organization is going to be super, super tough. It's not going to be straightforward. And to be honest, the people that you need to convince are not here. The people who you need to convince are the people who are at work today or doing whatever else they're doing and not being here. So the first step is you're going to want to build your fellowship. Are there any copyright lawyers in the audience? There's some slight copyright infringement happening. So we're going to ignore that for now. But you're going to start building your fellowship. You need a crew of people to come and help you make GraphQL a success. So who are you going to recruit? Who are you going to look for, right? You can't just ask people to help. Maybe you want to find specific people to help, people who may not originally think that they want to help you figure out what GraphQL looks like. So the first set of people that you might look for are people who have a lot of experience building APIs, people with a lot of experience storing lots and lots of data. And I'm talking about backend engineers. So I'm not generalizing that backend engineers look like dwarves and have beards and stuff like that. I'm saying that they're good at storing treasure and data like dwarves, not that they are dwarves, just to be clear. So the first thing that you're going to want to tell your backend engineers is we've covered this before earlier, is GraphQL can serve as a dynamic presentation service. Now, what does this mean? When we think about our applications that are joining all this complex sets of data from all different kinds of places, that whole process is a result of how REST works. REST has resources, or whatever API system you're using has specific endpoints that have different concerns, and that makes sense for backend. The thing is that you are pulling all these things into one place, and they're likely from different domains. So this is happening already. Either you're doing it in your client when you're making 3 fetch calls and you're pulling them in one place and you're joining them on some JSON object, or maybe you have these presentation services that the backend engineers have created that uniquely identify the exact data that you need for a particular view. Now, that's kind of that's a little frustrating, right? Like, do backend engineers really want to spend a lot of time doing one-off presentation services? maybe they do. Maybe you ask them and they're like, yeah, this is my job. I love doing this. I love just adding individual fields on this JSON object, and this is the purpose of my life. Ask them, though. I would expect that they probably say no. That time that they spend doing all that work, they could probably spend doing something more interesting. I expect that there's a lot of other things that they might want to do. Another thing that you might want to tell them is you can let the product define the API. So a lot of times, backend engineers are defining an API because that's sort of the domain of the storage. Like, it's like, all right, this storage thing makes more sense as an array, so I'm going to expose it as an array. But ultimately, what are we here to do, right? We're here to build product. And for backend engineers, there's a lot of layers of indirection from the thing that they're working with and the thing that your end user is going to see. So why does the API that they're exposing why is that the API that our front-end engineers use or our web engineers have to use to build our product? So what's nice here is we're basically saying if we care about building our product, let's let the product define the API. The other thing that's beneficial here is communication through this really strict contract, this GraphQL contract, makes it a clear source of truth as to what you're building against. So instead of arguing about, OK, I'm going to build this thing, and I'm going to add this field, turns out it doesn't integrate this way, or all this back and forth, all this sorts of stuff, you can get to a place where you can completely parallelize your communication. You figure out what the schema is that makes sense for your product, and then you can go off and work on your own things, come back in and see, OK, does this make sense? And it's nice. It's a really, really great process. So there's a few questions that your backend engineers are definitely going to ask you. And that's a big part of what I want to expose here is that these questions are important to understand and understand why they come from different perspectives. So first is it secure? And in this case, I'm going to call security as like, is this a vector for attack? Is this something that could potentially break the site or harm our business in any way? I don't know if it's like, yeah, that's the definition we'll go with here. So one piece that you might not be thinking about a lot is your schema. If you are launching new features and you're creating new types in your GraphQL schema, you might be leaking some extra stuff through that schema. So you can definitely, and what you definitely should do here is you can block introspection queries. You can even use different schemas based on different authorization schemes or just different clients. But definitely something to think about and a good answer for this particular problem. The other thing that you have to think about, too, is request fan-out. Based on the sort of naive implementation of GraphQL, you might find that it makes a ton of requests if that's sort of how you designed your GraphQL server. And you really gotta understand that that might happen, right? There might be a lot of circular calls, right? So you have to think about how you cache your data calls, your API calls. And I will tell you that batch calls are your friend. Basically, everything that you can batch, you should, and it'll make things a lot easier for you as you move forward. Another question that your backend engineer might ask you is it performant, right? And for some definition of performance, I would also say that the things that you want to bring up here are around how we think about performance. So in this case, GraphQL gives us the ability to understand performance in a way that's very different than in the past. If we can track metadata about the resolution of a particular field, we can actually figure out how expensive a particular product is. We can figure out what things that we need to take care of, and we can think about the usage of those fields. For example, if you have a really, really slow field or resolver, but you never use it, do you even care, right? Do you even care if this thing is slow if you're not going to actually use it? The other thing that I think is a really great benefit here for GraphQL in the performance conversation is caching. Now, with caching with REST, it can be a little difficult, right? If you have a field that has, I don't know, if you have some REST API that surfaces a gigantic JSON object and 9 out of the 10 fields are cacheable, but the last one is not, you can't cache it, right? You always, the server doesn't know which things you need, and so it just says, I can't cache any of this. But with field selection, we can actually say, if you're not even using that thing that you can't cache, we can actually cache the rest of it. So now your queries define the cacheability of the data that you're retrieving, rather than just arbitrary the thing that the API exposes. So you have your dwarves, dwarf-like personas that are helping you with your data. Who else are you going to need on this journey? So the next set of people that you're going to need, they've lived for a very long time. They've seen everything go down. They always happen to have an answer. They have, they're very high and mighty and all that stuff. Mobile engineers. So again, I'm not saying that you're an elf, but elves live for a long time and they never forget. So this is important because for mobile engineers, the things that they think about are breaking changes, right? The life cycle of an application is much, 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 much longer than your typical web client. So if you break an API tomorrow, it's going to break all of the previously deployed mobile applications for all the people who have not updated their applications. So how does GraphQL fit into that? So what's nice is that in the past, we kind of unknowingly broke mobile clients. But with GraphQL, we can actually just do it on purpose. So now that we have this information about the usage of our schemas and the schema types themselves, we'll know if we're doing something, and we can figure out what the ramifications are. We're making the implicit explicit. And GraphQL also gives us a much deeper understanding of what a breaking change actually is. For example, if you break an entire schema and you remove a field, like maybe in the GitHub API that you mentioned that we saw earlier, if no one is using that field, is it actually a breaking change? No, I mean, it breaks the contract that you had, but if no one's actually using it, it doesn't matter. Let's actually just send that through. The other thing that's nice is that with GraphQL, you can get these perfect payloads, nothing more, nothing less. And again, this makes is a really good thing for mobile engineers and the mobile apps that they're shipping. Some questions that they might ask a little bit about how to use GraphQL in their cache. One thing that I've heard after talking to a couple of mobile teams, of course, you want to try and serve stale data where possible. So you can take advantage of some of the cache normalization. This is really dependent on the next piece, which is how does this interface with existing data models? Prototypically, you're going to see that for any application or all of the things that you're working on, it's hard to get a fresh start. You're working in an existing application. You're working with existing constraints. You're working with existing tools. For all the things that are not web, or, you're going to have a lot of different interfaces for how you deal with data already, right? So you don't want to just replace that thing. You want to try and integrate. So how can you address that problem? In this case, code generation is your closest friend. Code generation means that you can just make those data models that the mobile applications are using, and they can just use it like they use it, and they can use GraphQL to query things. So you still get the power of the payloads of GraphQL, but you get this nice flexibility of using the typed data models that those applications are using already. All right, so you got your dwarves, you got your elves. And you need a little bit more. You need some more help. You can't just do that. You have more people in your organization. So who knows a lot about change, and who is easily swayed by new technologies and trends? This might be useful. You never know. OK, web engineers. So your web engineers are your humans, easily swayed by the power of things like GraphQL. And this is important too. You need champions throughout your organization. You need to convince other people that GraphQL makes sense for the particular problems that you're facing. So one thing that I've found is, as I'm talking to other web engineers, is that while there is certainly a lot of value in making these expressive APIs from our backends, it's actually a really good way of taking all this junk that we have in our client side and pushing that to the backend. So you can kind of hit it from both sides. And that's great, because we all know that our JavaScript applications are doing all sorts of weird stuff with JSON and all of the stuff that we're fetching from these APIs. And this is important because for web engineers, particularly with such complex applications, there's a lot of times where you're doing little computations. The example that we have at Coursera is that we always want to display a professor's full name, and it'll be like title, 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 first name, last name. But on mobile, it might just be title, first name, last name. And it's like very inconsistent, right? But that derived data doesn't make it to our API. It's a hard thing to talk about. Okay, you're designing this storage layer for instructors. You should definitely expose this field where you're going to display different things in different ways. They're really related to use case, how much space you have on the screen, all that sort of stuff, right? And so those are the things that we don't take into account, and those are the things that we end up coding into our clients rather than putting into the API. And again, other talks that we've heard about today, GraphQL can pave over some of these state management solutions like Redux. Now, this is huge. This means that you, again, have one single API that you can use for all of your data, no matter where it is. One thing to tell your web engineers about this. One is that tell them that type safety is cool. It's hip. It's fresh. It will make sure that they are the most popular kids on the block. And this is actually true because type safety is actually really awesome. Being able to do things like validating what APIs you're accessing at compile time is like mind-blowing. GraphQL schemas give us the power to do incredible things that you're not even aware of right now. I saw this library, and I have to tell you all about it. I saw this library called Babel Blade, and it's written by Jon Wong. And what it does is that instead of you writing your GraphQL queries, it parses your JavaScript and sees which objects you access on a data object and generates a GraphQL query for you. Wow, mind-blowing. You don't even have to write GraphQL queries anymore. You just use JavaScript. Anyway, schemas power that sort of tooling, and we couldn't get that before if we didn't have types, if we didn't have schemas. Some of the questions that your front-end engineers might ask, they Google a couple of things. They say, OK, which one should I use? Which GraphQL client should I use? Should I use Apollo? Should I use Relay? The first answer is you might not actually need a client. You don't need a client to use GraphQL servers or GraphQL backends. You could just use fetch if you really needed to. So definitely make sure that you need a lot of the benefits that Apollo gives you. And as you've seen before, there's a lot of great features. Make sure that you understand the complexities that it brings with regards to bundle size, developer velocity, all that sort of stuff. So underneath all of this, you want to make sure that you're actually solving problems that your organization has. Another question that they're going to ask, too, is that they see schemas, they see types, they see APIs. They start asking, how does this actually change how we build products? And absolutely, it does. If you take GraphQL to the extreme and you are using this idea of schema-first development, it's going to be really weird because you might have always thought about just building UI, but now you're also building the API. You're also creating types. But it's so much more expressive, and I think there's a lot of benefits to that. So you have to acknowledge that it's a little bit strange, but they have to buy into it. Otherwise, it'll just not work out. So other people that you need to convince in the organization. One is some people who want to be able to move a little faster, who want to try some new things. These are your ints. These are your product people. They were just trees in the forest. But now that they hear about GraphQL, they start moving, and they start gathering together, and they start taking down giant towers. And this is really important because that's what we're trying to sell, is that with GraphQL, we can increase the velocity of our developers. We can give them an ability to express their anger against Sauron or whatever. And the other piece, too, here is that your GraphQL APIs inevitably can be human readable. So they can explore the APIs, and they don't need to have a fundamental knowledge of how your system works in order to be able to explore and add to what it's capable of doing. And there's two more really important companions here, and we've got to make sure that we talk about them both. One is someone who can be a champion for you across the organization, someone who works behind the scenes to make you a successful engineer or whatever role you're in, someone who definitely has eagles and could have flown you to Mount Doom from the beginning and chooses not to do it. Gandalf, your manager, has been trying to get you to do all these things to grow as a human. And he's trying to make sure that he's opening the right doors to get you to Mount Doom so that you can get this great GraphQL goodness. They're definitely going to ask you, how can I help? Because they don't know anything about GraphQL. They're not here. They are depending on you to tell them how to help. And as I've mentioned before, there's a few ways and a few people that they're going to need to reach out and really be a champion for GraphQL at your organization. The last person that you need on this journey is someone who makes developers' lives easier and someone who wants to work better with others. GraphQL by itself, with one person, it's OK. It could be much better. But if your entire organization and your entire team speaks GraphQL, it's great. It's this one language that you can all use together. And that's you, right? On this journey, this is you. You're the best resource that your organization has to make GraphQL successful. And I don't know which of these two you are. You can be Sam, you can be Frodo, you could be their backpacks, you could be whatever. But what you need to know here is that, again, you're their best resource, and you need to understand what the problems are and what GraphQL solves. Don't just add GraphQL because you got to go to this conference and you heard me talk and you said, that sounds great. Make sure that it solves the problems, and I think it'll be easy to convince others. The second piece, you have your fellowship. You've figured out all the people that are going to go on this journey with you. The second piece here is figuring out what your architecture looks like. And this is your map. This is figuring out where am I going? Where are we even going to try and go with this? There are three main sort of architectures that I've heard of or seen. And of course, every organization is going to have some flavor, some combination of these things. The first one is GraphQL native. This is GraphQL is your end-all, be-all. You love it so much that you put everything in GraphQL, your authentication, your authorization. It accesses all your databases, your schemas there, your resolvers are there. And this is typical for maybe some new applications or people trying things out. And this is great. This is a great solution, especially for getting started. Another strategy that might be a good destination to get to is the API gateway. The API gateway means that GraphQL just becomes a router. It says, for these particular requests, we're going to go here and proxy this request here. For these requests over here, let's go over here. And in this case, the GraphQL layer is super thin. And this thin GraphQL layer just ends up proxying all this data to the underlying services on the left there. Your schemas likely come from somewhere else. And your resolvers likely are just the execution of this particular API in that server itself. The last one, and this one is the one that I'm seeing a lot more often, is the hybrid architecture, the layered architecture. And this is interesting because what this does is that this adds GraphQL at every layer. So in your client, you have your client-side schema that we heard from Apollo earlier. You have your GraphQL schema that's happening at the GraphQL server layer. You might have some business logic in a resolver on in the GraphQL layer there. And the schemas might come from this backing service that is a normal REST API. It might be the middle layer. It might be the top layer. But ultimately, your source of truth becomes the aggregation of all of those things. And I think that's the most flexible and the one that's also the most complex. All right, you figured out where you need to go. You're trying to figure out how are you going to get there. Of course, you could have used the eagles, but Gandalf said, no, we're not going to use the eagles. Someone in the back's like, oh, there's a good reason why. It's like, OK, no. The eagles could have solved a lot of problems really early on. First off, you need schemas. Schemas are really important. If you don't have these on your REST APIs, if you don't have this on any part of your service, you're going to have some issues. You want to get that. Figure out how you do it. You might be able to mock your HTTP requests and guess at what the schema is. But unless you have a schema, you're going to have a hard time adopting GraphQL. Another strategy here that's going to be important for getting to GraphQL across your organization is figuring out how you're actually going to adopt it, how you're going to actually insert this into your runtime. And there's a couple of different ways that I find that are really interesting for incremental adoption. One way might be to say, we have this huge product. Let's take this one piece. Let's make that all in GraphQL. We'll build the server. We'll build all that sort of stuff. And that's a great strategy. You figure out the whole sort of cut of GraphQL to figure out how the tooling works, how the workflows work, all that sort of stuff. Another one that I'm hearing that's really interesting, too, is to move your entire client to 100% GraphQL. Now, you might be saying, John, that doesn't sound like incremental adoption. That's the thing we're trying not to do. Well, in this case, your client is actually still making the same REST calls and the same calls that it was making before. But your UI is using GraphQL to make those declarations. And so now you can actually see which data you need and which data you need to replace underneath that GraphQL schema to create the GraphQL server. And so you can actually test out GraphQL without even using a server at all. You can just have everything in the client. Another point to make here is that definitely invest in tooling. We saw that incredible demo by Adam where he added this thing and shipped some stuff. The only reason that that's available is that there was a lot of investment in tooling, right? Without the tools, he's just guessing at a lot of these things. So a small amount of investment really pays off whether it's with validation, whether it's code generation. All of these things matter, and you want to make the developer experience really, really good. Ultimately, that's one of the biggest sells for GraphQL. Another thing that you will definitely need to figure out is what your metric of success is. And a lot of people get caught up. They see GraphQL. They say, OK, we have a giant query. We think this will make things faster. Let's use that. Well, what happens if it's not faster? What happens if, for whatever reason, the APIs are slow, or the resolution strategy is weird, or you're building a GraphQL server for the first time and you make some rookie mistakes? Suddenly, your project is not doing well, right? But if we want to back up and think about, there are lots of other things that you can use to measure the success of an adoption of a technology like GraphQL. Developer velocity, really, really important. Consistency, really important. Type safety, like I mentioned, really important. All of these things are really great cuts to justify some of the work that you're doing here. And inevitably, these are all really great improvements for the developer experience of your engineers. So this one was really cool. So you figured out your fellowship, you figured out where you're going, you figured out how you're going to get there. But what do you do when you get there? You're like, great, we have GraphQL, now what? And these are the questions that are important too, because you don't want to get blindsided by this. As soon as you get that GraphQL thing in production, you have everything running, someone is going to ask you, who owns this GraphQL server? This server that runs between your entire organization. Who's responsible for this? Who deploys this? How do you make changes to it, right? What happens if this is being backed by some data store and that thing changes? How do you coordinate schema changes? These are the important questions that you only get to after you've deployed everything and you realize that you're the one responsible and you're the one staying up late and you're the one whose fault it is that the entire site broke, right? So making sure that you understand what the answer to this early on will give you a lot more sleep at night, hopefully. And definitely evangelization. How do you even use GraphQL? This is not a talk about how do you use the syntax for GraphQL, but this is a talk about what are the conventions around how we use GraphQL. For example, do we make a lot of little queries? Do we use fragments? Do we name our fragments? Do we have to use IDs? Do we have to capture all this extra information? And how do we use the more advanced parts of GraphQL? Deferred queries, live queries, all these things that are really, really powerful. You're going to need to teach people to have that kind of discussion. All right. OK, cool. We are coming up to the end. So right here, we're going to wrap up. The big piece here, we have 4 main things that you're going to have to think about as you're building this case for GraphQL. First, build your fellowship. Figure out who amongst your organization you need to convince. It cannot be just yourself. It's not going to happen. It's going to be really tough. Find other people, convince them, figure out what they need, and figure out how GraphQL solves that need. Second is figure out what your destination is. You're going to need to orchestrate a lot of things. A lot of changes are going to happen. Figure out that first so that you can work together to get there. Third is get a lift, get an eagle, get something. Find a way to get there that makes sense for you. And in the end, you'll make developers' lives better. I want to have a quick shout out to Eve, Sasha, Frederick, Gago. Thank you so much for helping provide a lot of the meat of this talk for me. And thank you all for showing up.